Good morning, everyone. Here we are at week number 7 in Biology 120 Lab. We've got a lot going on, so let's get going. So last week you learned all about Mendelian genetics, like dominant and recessive traits and how they're passed along into offspring. You did some Punnett squares, which is an organized way to sort gametes into new offspring. And so you saw what possible offspring were produced by different parents, and you learned about patterns of inheritance, different ways that we inherit traits. So it was all about genetics and inheritance. This week we're going to move on into a bigger picture. So we're looking at relationships in biology. For example, food webs, and how do organisms fit into food webs? Who do they consume? Who consumes them? How are nutrients and energy passed through ecosystems? Those are food webs. We're going to look at population dynamics, how populations change depending on birth rate, death rate, and so on. And demographics, studying populations of organisms, including human beings, because that's what we're doing in the last exercise, including human beings. Just one business that does this all the time is insurance companies. They want to know what your chances are of dying at any point in your life, and they're betting that you're not going to die, and you're betting that you are going to die, and that's why you buy insurance. So anyway, demographics are important. So this week you got a lot to do. Oh, goodness, you got a lot to do. So first of all, you need to draw a food web. The instructions are all in your lab instructions. You're going to make drawings of the relationships between different organisms in a Florida ecosystem, and you're going to answer the questions. And I'm going to show you in just a second an example of how you draw those arrows. You don't have to put pictures in there. If you want to, that is perfectly fine. But if you just want to put the name, muskrat, heron, whatever it is, sawgrass, but I don't think muskrats are in there, but they're kind of cool. Anyway, you can just put the words in there. But if you want to put pictures, that is fine. The next exercise, 7.2 lab, is all about carrying capacity and demographics. You are not doing activity 4. Just realize that. 1, 2, and 3 are going to take time to do. There's some calculations that you have to do. And there's graphing. Oh, yeah, we're back to that graphing. So if you get stuck with that, just let me know, and I'll help you with it. Yeah, there's more graphing. What to graph in this particular lab? In activity 1, all 4 lines. So all of those R values, and then the values, the data that you got in the table. You're going to graph 4 lines. In activity 2, all right, when you make a data table, here's a clue for you. When you make a data table in biology, usually it's the last column of data that you're the most interested in. You're doing all these different calculations across, but it's that last column that is important. So in activity 2, you will graph population growth rate in that last column on the y-axis versus time interval on the x-axis. Do this for the data tables 2A and 2B, okay? Population growth rate. You're not graphing all the rest of the data in that table, just that last column. The same thing is true for activity 3. Survivorship per 1,000 human beings on the y-axis. Years and decades on the x-axis. There will be 2 lines because you have 2 cohorts, so you could have chosen males and females. You could have chosen 2 different time periods, 1800, 1850, 1850 to 1900. Whatever it was that you chose, because you're choosing this. And a note about those gravestone cards, if you choose to use those, do look at them first, because the way that Carolina Biological has put those together, they kind of group them, like all the infants are in one group of cards, and all the females are in one group of cards. So you got to kind of be careful about that, so that you're not just choosing one little group. So do take a look at them before you start doing that last activity. I want to mention how studying food webs and ecosystems is even important to us as human beings by giving you an example from 1993. So in 1993, there were a number of people in the Four Corners area of the United States, and that includes Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, and this where all these states come together in that one spot. There were some young people who were dying very quickly from pneumonia. And no one understood what in the world was going on, because all of a sudden these perfectly healthy young people, early 20s, were dying from pneumonia. Well, the Native Americans had a saying in this area that spring rains will cause young men to die. So what in the world? And some researcher thought about this because they had heard of this saying, and they went, wonder what the connection is. So we discovered that a hantavirus was causing this type of pneumonia. So where in the world did the hantavirus come from? It came from mice and mouse droppings and mouse urine. So the one thing in common that these all young people who died had was that they had been cleaning up areas where mice had been. They'd been sweeping, mopping, moving stuff, boxes and things, and this is where mice had been. And so they were kicking up all this dust from mouse feces and mouse urine that had dried. They were breathing it in, becoming infected with the hantavirus, and it was killing some of them. Well, where did the mice come from? Remember the saying, spring rains. So it had rained a good bit in the springtime in this area, which means that all the grasses, all the plants were producing tons and tons of seeds. And when there's an excess food source like this, what happens to the mouse population? It explodes. And so mice were moving out into areas where people normally live, getting in so many houses and buildings, etc. And people were having to clean up from them, try to trap them, and all of that. And so young people were dying. So you see the Native American saying, spring rains bring death in young men, was actually true, and it was based on biology. So you can see what happens when there's a population explosion in an ecosystem of mice. This totally affected the human population, and it's because of hantavirus. So that's a very cool connection between all of these things, and shows you why it's so important to study ecosystems and all the relationships of organisms in an ecosystem. All right, I did want to mention about food webs. This is what a food web should look like, and you notice I just put words here instead of pictures. This is how you draw a food web. Notice the direction of the arrows. That's what's so important, because what you're doing when you're drawing a food web is you're showing the flow of energy through the food web. And so alligators eat. You'd think the arrows will go in the other direction. That's not true. The alligators eat turtles, bass, that's a kind of fish, of course, and egrets, which is a kind of bird. But the energy flow goes from those organisms that are consumed by the alligator to the alligator, because the alligator benefits from those organisms. So that's how you draw the arrows in a food web. Show the flow of energy. How is the energy moving through the food web? All right, then also you have your final project submission in week number 7. You're going to have completed your experiment. So if you're doing the Manduka caterpillar experiment, you have to look at all those data and put them together and graph them, that sort of thing. If you're doing the ice experiment, then you have to actually do the experiment. If you're doing the nervous experiment, you have to have a partner and do the little it's not pins, but touching experiment to find out the sensitivity of your test subject. What's the other one? Air pollution. So air pollution, you're going to have to look up those data that are published somewhere to compare an area in 2 different time periods or 2 different areas or whatever it is that you have set up. So you have to do your experiment this week, gather the results, graph the results, because you have to represent your data. You never just put raw data into a presentation. You have to represent it and then form your conclusions. You will also put together those first 2 milestones and write them out in sentence form and put these into slides. So you're going to need 7 to 10 slides to show what you did in this presentation. Make sure that last slide, besides the references, but the last slide is your conclusion slide. What did you figure out about this problem that you examined? That's important to do. Make sure you use resources and references, and these should help back up what your conclusion is about what your study was. Okay? Don't forget to include a reference section also. So 7 to 10 slides in PowerPoint or something similar. Google Slides does this too, and that's free. So is PowerPoint if you get Microsoft 365. So anyway, you're making slides for your presentation. So that is also due this week. Yeah, so there's a lot going on. And if you're in lecture, you have that huge final project in lecture too. So it's going to be a very busy week this week. I wanted to remind you that the end of the semester is June the 26th at midnight on that Sunday, and you cannot turn anything in past that time. Well, when the clock strikes midnight, like Cinderella, your time is up. And so all work has to be in by midnight. And you can't send anything to me to put in there because I can't put it in either. All I can do is grade from that point on. So just know that you've got to have everything turned in by June the 26th, Sunday. If you need any help or you have any questions this week, because you may come up against something this week, email me, m.sigmon@snhu.edu. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Have a great week. It's going to be a busy one.